The presentation today will explain the idea of Microsoft's adaptive cloud and explore how Azure Arc can help organizations adapt their cloud strategy to meet evolving needs. I will talk and introduce a brief history of why times have changed here within the last couple of years to adapt to this new strategy. I will then dive into Azure Arc a little bit because you're going to see it as a mainstay in the Azure, adaptive cloud scene. And then we're going to dive into a quick demo so you can kind of see it live in motion. Now, I do apologize. I don't know if you guys can hear a little bit of humming in the background, but I do live in Texas, and right now our ACs are working about 130%. So I do apologize that, but we'll get started. So real quick call out to the sponsors for the Canadian Cloud Summit. Thank you very much. It's crucial because they're the ones that make this summit possible, and we appreciate their expertise and commitment to cloud innovation. So thank you very much. So Microsoft's vision. If you look at the environment of cloud computing and public cloud from 2008, give or take a couple of years, to about 2016, 2015, Microsoft's cloud strategy focused on establishing Azure as a primary destination for your cloud workloads. AWS was ahead of the game, and Azure was trying to catch up. Key elements of this initial phase was transition to flexible payments, right? Everyone heard the words OpEx versus CapEx, and how cloud would stop the bleeding of money, burning in your pockets, and from investing tens of thousands of dollars on hardware. Enhanced scalability, right? Elasticity is what we started to hear. Expanding environments within a few seconds. You need to right size, scale out, and then ensuring robust security measures, right? We started to look at that SaaS platform where a lot of the responsibilities start to fall on other vendors. This period also marked a significant shift towards cloud native tools. Similar today, how we see with AI and its revolution, the cloud revolution during that time also made every company shift to a SaaS platform model, right? Everyone started to all of a sudden turn from perpetual licensing to SaaS models. Well, around 2017 or so, Microsoft realized that not every customer was going to go into the cloud. Many of the workloads were just not Azure ready. A lot of them were going to be too expensive to hold one service, one role in the cloud. And then you ran into sovereignty and compliance issues. Microsoft quickly pivoted and evolved its cloud strategy from a cloud-first strategy to a more adaptive approach. Incidentally, this is around when Azure HCI was first introduced, right? That first vector that we start seeing where they're shifting out of the Azure cloud platform. They actually start to say, hey, you can start having Azure on-prem, right? With this Azure HCI, the hyper-converged solution. This shift emphasizes a customer-centric model, right? Where the customer can choose. They allow organizations to choose where their execution environments are, either public, hybrid, multi-cloud, whatever the infrastructure may be. Azure Arc plays a very pivotal role in this strategy, enabling resource management across diverse infrastructures while ensuring consistent governance and security. At the end of the day, Microsoft's adaptive cloud has one core solution. It wants to emphasize a unified, flexible, and secure experience across all infrastructures. It highlights the importance of running applications where they're most effective and most efficient. Managing environments has to be consistent. Azure Arc is essentially just a tool, but it's an essential component of this strategy, enabling organizations to leverage Azure innovations such as AI, automation, beyond the Azure cloud. So if you could think of all the benefits of Azure and bring them closer to your environment, pretty much that's what Azure Arc wants to do. The concept of Microsoft Adaptive Cloud revolves around viewing the cloud as a dynamic ecosystem rather than a remote data center, right? If you consider that first strategy that they had, right, it was Azure out in the data centers throughout the world. They realized that just separates it. There's too big of a gap. A dynamic ecosystem allows you to focus on your needs, but still leverage Azure services, still leverage what makes Azure a public cloud entity. This vision fosters a culture of flexibility, encouraging collaboration amongst development, operations, security teams, right? If you think about how security, their main concern is those workloads, right? Where are they at? How are they being administered? If you could have that single pane of glass, it would be so much easier to administer this. Same thing with operations. If they have to worry about troubleshooting, they have to worry about actually seeing those environments. How can we see it if I have to dive into vCenter, and then I have to dive into Azure, and then I have to dive into XYZ, right? And then development. How can we quickly and elastically deploy these VMs within all clouds, only having to use one single pane of glass? By optimizing workload management based on performance, cost, and compliancy, organizations can better adapt to this unique need, their unique needs. Since it's a strategy, that cloud strategy will differ, and it will not be the same for everyone. And just so we're kind of clear, we're going to focus a lot more on hybrid cloud and multi-cloud. Hybrid cloud is that computing approach that uses a combination of on-prem, private cloud, public cloud, right, AWS, GCP, while multi-cloud actually uses multiple cloud and storage services, right? So there is a brief difference, but we'll kind of see that in a minute here. So a couple of examples of that adaptive cloud, right? Because remember, adaptive cloud is a strategy. It's not a resource. It's not something you're going to download, something you're going to install. It's just a way of thinking. How can I be more efficient, and how can I maybe increase cost or decrease cost? How can I manage this environment? Some of the examples include a hybrid edge services, hybrid cloud, like I mentioned it could be a private cloud. We'll see AWS, we'll see GCP here in a minute. Multi-cloud, right? Public clouds simultaneously. IoT devices, right? We see a lot of these IoT devices even in our home. Well, they all contain they all use an IP, they all send TCP/IP traffic. Those are just extensions of a network. How can we manage them in a warehouse? How can we manage them in a distribution center? And then distributed cloud services in different physical locations, but where you don't even have the full responsibility stack that you would in a public cloud. So adaptive cloud at a glance. Again, like I mentioned before, it is a strategy, right? The emphasis nowadays is tailoring to be three critical aspects. One of them is that central management, right? But with AI, now it's central management and security enhanced by artificial intelligence, right? With AI. It leverages all those background tools, and it lets you have a central management interface. A lot of your third-party vendors now are selling their products with AI in the background, right? Single pane of glass with AI enhancements. Also, another purpose of adaptive cloud is to rapidly deploy and scale applications across all boundaries. If you want to deploy VMs, the same web app in the cloud as you want to do in Azure Local, well, you could do that very quickly. And although Azure Local will use that Azure portal to deploy, it's still going to be right next to your data center. And then the data, right? It wants to be able to cultivate and have insights across all physical operations. Now, I just mentioned services. The other component of that is the architecture platform, right? What platforms can we distribute? What platforms can reach, what services can reach these platforms? We have multi-cloud, right? And we've already talked about the Azure regions. There's third-party cloud. Again, we'll talk about AWS. We'll talk about GCP. There's hybrid computer or customer data centers, branch offices, which we're probably going to see the most. And then there's edge and IoT, right? The actual warehouses that no one actually manages, but we know there's hundreds of IoT devices or edge networking components. As we dive further, now we know the infrastructure. Now we know there's services to it. What are the core components that Azure and Microsoft wants you to leverage? Like I mentioned earlier, in the AI portion, you'll start seeing copilots for Azure. You'll start seeing, just like you do with M365, all services will have that embedded AI layer on it. You'll see monitoring. You'll see Defender for Cloud. Those components will inject data points into Microsoft Copilot for Azure and all the other copilots to give you concise and informative information. You'll see Visual Studio GitHub. Again, Copilot has GitHub as well, and AKS. Those components are the development portion of this. You'll be able to leverage and deploy any type of application workload to all the architectures that you see on the right-hand side. And then you have the data, right? IoT operations, Fabric, which is the next gen SaaS model of all the data platforms from Microsoft. And machine learning. All this data, you want to be able to turn it and actually get productive results, right? So all these components want all the services to reach all the possible infrastructures. And then we dive at the very bottom, right? You probably recognize this, especially if you've been working in Azure. All these components, in one way or to another, make part of that adaptive cloud, right? Even the portal, right? When you log into it, Copilot for Azure, like I said, automation, the policies. We'll see a lot of these actually here in a minute when it comes to the governance component, so monitoring, policies, Defender. The development side, you'll also see where you'll see Kubernetes, app services, be able to manage these single pane of glass, although they're spread out through different infrastructures. And then the data component, we'll talk about this a little bit less, but just think of that data component as being the most important part of your adaptive cloud. You want to make sure that that data is accessible so it can actually be processed to every other component. Now, let's talk a little bit about Azure Arc. I explained how adaptive cloud will create that strategy for your environment, right? As far as data, you want it to spread out, but at the end of the day, data is data, right? You need to have something else that manipulates it. Either be a application workload, so VMs, as maybe Kubernetes. Azure Arc is a tool, like I mentioned before, that has the capability of letting you manage it in a type of ops as a service role. They could do update management for your Arc-enabled servers, change tracking. They could do machine configuration states, desired state configurations with Azure Policy. Azure Policy is actually one of the key features of Azure Arc. It could do Windows Admin Center. So I could actually administer hundreds of VMs from one single pane of glass. And I could do it without VPNs, without public IPs. And I could deep dive into the Vim viewer. I could see the roles. I could see the management components. Remote support, again, without VPN, without public IP. I could also do a network hub. Similar to Azure Local, the underlying component of all these infrastructure tools for Microsoft are built off of Hyper-V and Server Cluster Manager. So we could see a lot of those components that we normally would see there in a network heading. Best practices. On the Azure platform, we're going to be able to see best practices assessments. And we could actually start implementing some of those compliance components like Azure Site Recovery, Azure Backup. And then it even actually deep dives into licensing, right? We could do pay as you go for servers, for SQL. We can do additional extended security updates, for your older versions. Azure Arc is the tool to be able to perform that ops as a service. Before the demo, I did want to go over a couple of because I know you're kind of seeing too many PowerPoint slides without pictures. So I want to kind of point out the architecture, the Azure Arc architecture. It's very important to understand that all these components at the extremity of this picture are infrastructure components, right? vCenter, System Center Manager, Azure Local, right? And at the bottom, you can see how there's a resource bridge between the resources and in Azure and in the private cloud. That resource bridge is what combines. That's the architecture arm between the two. But at the end of the day, Azure Arc is still a service, right? It just extends that capability amongst other infrastructures. Here's a little bit better view of what is possible with Azure Arc. On the top part of this, we could see how Azure Arc will extend these services from Azure onto your different located infrastructure components, workloads. Azure Policy, we have RBAC, we have resource templates, tagging. We can do Azure Audits, Sentinel, Defender for Cloud, all those components that you would normally see in an Azure cloud-only environment, you could extend it, right? The services include threat protection, monitoring, logging, change tracking, extensibility, patching, updates, auto management. And then all the components at the bottom would actually benefit from this. All the components in Azure, right, will natively be able to support this. So you don't actually have to Arc enable them. But the Arc enablement from all other environments, either Azure Local, VMware Sphere, or vCenter, AWS, and Google Platform. Okay, let's go for a quick demo real quick. So I want to start off with, and thumbs up real quick if y'all could see my Azure portal. Thank you.
We can see it, yep.
Perfect, okay. So I have a couple of screenshots here, or a couple of portals here I want to show, and then we'll kind of dive into some of the features. I do want to show some of the VMs that I have deployed here. So we have, this is going to be my test VM. All Azure native tools do not need Azure Local, because as you can see right now, they have exposure to all the components that we want, all the other native tools to be able to access. But here we have a GCP compute engine, right? We have an instance right here. And then in AWS, we can also see we have a running instance here. And actually, if we go to, I want to show you that I actually have one VM running. This one right here, although I have more, because AWS actually has a connector that actually is able to bring in a lot more information. So we go to Azure Arc portal, and again, this is just a single pane of glass of this. We can see Azure Arc here. Now the key components here are going to be machines, which are the VMs, Kubernetes clusters. We can see the different host environments that you would connect to this. Azure Local, vCenter, SCCM. We have the data components. This is specifically services that will work with your data components. So it strips that that IaaS layer if it has it, like for example, a SQL server, and it actually talks to the data components of it. Internet of Things, again, very because of the operations that they do, you have quick access to that. Application services. Now, a lot of these are preview, and I'm gonna talk about a feature at the very end about a very useful app service that we'll be getting to later on. And then the licensing component, right? Now at the bottom here, we can see management. Now, most of these components are for organizational purposes, you know, the customer location site manager. The Azure Arc gateway is for your resources to be able to talk to Azure without having to open so many ports. In my demo, I didn't need it, but that will allow for compliancy reasons. Private link scopes obviously allows more for local connectivity. The multi-cloud is actually something I did use. The multi-cloud connector allows you to be able to connect your AWS subscriptions to this, or your resources to this. As you can see here, you know, it's very small, but I do have a cloud component here. And if we go back to my Azure Arc machines here, we could see that we have these top components up here, AWS, right? On my EC2 global view, there were 3 VMs. This one down here is the one that was turned on, and that's why it's recognizing that it's in the Ubuntu VM. If we click on this, we can see the different capabilities. Now, Azure Arc, again, is that bridge for the services. Some of these services do cost, right? Some of these will have an added cost to it. Most of the metrics will have to store that data, right? So you'll have data charges on there off of log analytics. And then you'll have features like updates, policies that'll have, you know, a couple of dollars a charge per unit per VM. But that's leveraging, you know, those features. Without that, you could still leverage a single pane of glass. You could still leverage the visibility to it. Copilot is enabled on all of these, so you can, you know, receive information. In fact, I had a problem where one of my extensions didn't work. I asked Copilot what was going on, and then it gave me a kind of a step-by-step of what I can look at. You can leverage the main thing that you could leverage on a free version of this is going to be visibility, right? You could see the components here, obviously cloud providers, AWS. It gives me a couple of components here that are going to be printed just to AWS. But again, that visibility is there. The other two were turned off. That's why we're not seeing it connected here. But I wanted to show you that the AWS connector actually pulls everything in there. If I had storage accounts, it would pull them in there. And I'll show you how that actually adds on to Defender. Right now, it's more of the Azure Arc component part of it. We can also see the instance I have in GCP. Here we can see that the cloud provider is actually GCP. All different components, all different resources will have different capabilities. The reason we see more boxes here is because this one is a Windows VM. If we go here, we can see that this one was Ubuntu. That's why we can see more capabilities on here. And then Azure and Hyper-V, Azure Local, all those components will have even more abilities aside from the multi-cloud resources. If we go back to the GCP component, so here we could see Windows Admin Center to manage this, and we'll see this here in a minute. We can also see that you could turn on site recovery. There's a component that we'll see within the Windows Admin Center that will actually go in there and start doing cost analysis for migrations. We could see that we can implement policies here. So you could actually implement compliancy to VMs in different locations and make sure that they're compliant to the same policies. Monitoring insights, right? So you can start building dashboards. Let's say you wanted to validate, your web apps in GCP, and then your has web apps in Azure. Well, you can pull all that information into log, and then you can do custom queries based off of that. Updates, and then hot patch is actually a patching without reboots. That's actually compatible for 2025 VMs. Here's the best practices. Now, some of these I didn't turn on, but I'll show you just the Windows just so you can see it. Again, best practices is only available for Windows, so you'll see this a little bit. A lot of the features that I told you that are paid, if you have software assurance as a license type for your VM, a lot of it will actually turn on without having to pay for it. So that is also another configuration depending on what your licensing scheme is for your work. If we go back here, these are actually hosts that are physical hosts on here. We can see these are Dell, so it pulls in that data. And then if we dive straight from this portal here into Windows Admin Center, it's going to show us information based off of this VM. You will be able to do a single pane of glass, but I wanted to show you the difference here. So the Azure Arc component is utilizing the bridge that it has to pull in all this information. Because this is a open manage and I have the extension added, it's actually pulling some other information here that is available on the host, but normally you wouldn't pull it in. It actually gives me the iDRAC IP here if I wanted to log into the iDRAC here. I can enable disk metrics. I can verify certificates. Now, the certificates here are going to be specifically for that host. I can see different devices, right, that are connected to it. I could actually even see the VMs that are hosted on Hyper-V in this VM. So here's the VMs that are running on that host itself. And then if I wanted to manage it, we'll see a little bit more of this on the application, but we'll be able to turn on configure high availability. We'll actually be able to do site recovery, turn on site recovery on that. But again, this component is just an extension of the Arc-enabled physical host with the Windows Admin Center extension turned on. Very, very powerful. If we go back real quick to another component of Azure, it's Defender. Defender also has a connector that you can see different components. Here, you can see that it actually talks to AWS. It talks to my GCP project. And I could actually do compliancy to it. I can obviously push out coverage to it. You'll see how some of the, actually, if I go to inventory, you'll see here how it's giving me recommendations on my compute instance in GCP, on my EC2 instances in AWS. It's also pulling in other resources, right? If I had storage accounts here, like I said before, it could give me recommendations on that. It's truly an adaptive cloud when it comes to providing services for that. One of the key features here that I would also point out is the recommendation that you can give is based off of compliance. Azure has incorporated GCP compliancy and AWS compliancy. There's one that's just called overall Azure Cloud, and normally that's the one that's turned on. But if you really want to have a well-architected framework where you're following best practices from the vendors, it's really nice to be able to focus on those compliancy restrictions that each cloud provider provides. And Azure will give you that capability. So let's go into, let's see if I have it. This is Windows Admin Center based off of an application. Here you can see it's connecting to my local host, right, to my desktop. And here, if we go to computer management, let me see actually, we could see all the Arc enabled VMs. You could see the hosts that I was connected to earlier. So these are actually physical hosts that are located in my proximity. But then we could see here some other VMs. This is the VMs that we saw in, I believe this is the instance for Google Cloud. Here's the AWS. And then this is a VM that resides, I want to say, within host one. So we go to host one real quick. Again, you could see that single pane of glass. Now, this is a true single pane of glass, but you could see that we could see physical servers, we could see virtual servers, we could see multi-cloud servers. Also, you can see here that I can actually enable Azure Backup. So this would back up the OS that it's talking to. So this would be the host OS. But then I could actually dive into the virtual machine component. And like I showed earlier, if I select one of these VMs, I could actually start replicating with Azure Site Recovery, right? So straight from this single pane of glass, I can do that. I can do an assessment through Azure Migration, right? Let's assume that I have, again, through different, maybe spot data centers or spot Hyper-Vs throughout, the estate or a province, right? I have different VMs connected. Well, going to all those little satellite offices might be a little bit burning. But if I have all those Hyper-V servers located onto here, I could actually pick and choose if I want to do assessment. So it gives you the flexibility of doing assessments to VMs that are not even close to you. You don't have any type of connection other than that agent running on the host. It's not even running on the VM itself. You could also see different components of the host itself here. Obviously, storage replica, you could actually turn on some features. If we go to roles and features here, you can actually install all those server roles, similar to what you would do with Server Manager on the VM itself. You can see processes. We can run PowerShell. So you can see how that ops as a service is being provided by this application. The network hub that we were referring to, it'll actually pull in different networking components. We could actually see local users here, the firewall components, and then we'll go back to the Azure components that we were doing. Now, I don't believe I have Azure Monitor turned on. There are a lot of these features are in preview, right? So this one, for example, it's telling us, hey, this Azure Monitor is going to change because it's actually going to start using the monitoring agent. Azure Kubernetes Service. If you think of how Azure Local works, right? Azure Local is the UI is Azure with the components of Server Cluster Manager on the bottom. Well, with Azure Cluster Service, you can actually set up Kubernetes on this host through here. And when you see the components of it, you'll see that they're based off of the hyperconverged components. So very, very cool. This is actually part of the Cato Kubernetes based infrastructure layer that I'll talk about here at the very end. The hybrid center is more or less kind of what we were talking about, how you can enable these features. These are the core components that Microsoft feels that Azure is going to help you on your on-prem. And then again, you could turn on file sync. So it's really that single pane of glass for all this component. Now, as the last component, I wanted to show that Cluster Server Manager, right, is Hyper-V on steroids, essentially. It's going to allow you all those vCenter features that you would see when you're connecting vSphere, but for Hyper-V, right? So I don't have a cluster set up, but if you think of, like I explained earlier, Azure Local having that UI over Server Cluster Manager, well, same thing here, right? We can manage this. And actually, Windows Admin Center gives you a lot of capabilities that Azure Local will not do on the Azure interface. And if we see here, one last thing I want to show is extensions. So Windows and Microsoft are allowing all these components. Now, there's a lot more extensions that are installed because I was working on these. These are available components that I haven't installed yet. Pure Storage is in there. You'll notice that some of the bigger ones are on here. That gives you that last portion that I think a lot of people were missing whenever they wanted to maybe leverage Hyper-V and Server Cluster Manager, but did not have that flexibility or that visibility to the host. Well, with these extensions, now you can start doing that. Let's go back into any questions real quick. I do want to pause here because I think we could come back, but I think there's a lot of information here when it comes to the Azure Local. Let me pop this up again. I'm sorry, with Windows Server Manager, there's a lot of information. We can deep dive at the end, but the most important thing I want you to know is it's truly become a single pane of glass, right? It incorporates all those components that you would have to log into portals, how you would have to remote VPN into a different instance just so you can get that visibility. But it is truly becoming a single pane of glass. Okay, now the possibilities, right? I think I've talked about the infrastructure. I've talked about the services that it expands, right? That's that adaptive cloud. So what's possible? What are we expecting to see from this Azure or this adaptive cloud strategy and the key components, the key players in Azure, the adaptive cloud? Azure Local is probably the biggest thing you've heard since the renaming from Azure HCI. Azure Local gives you the flexibility that extends Azure's cloud capabilities on premise. A lot of it is going through Azure Arc because remember, Azure Arc is that bridge so you can see that visibility. Azure Management Services are built on top of Azure Local through that Azure Arc component. And you can uniformly oversee all those resources across Azure Local or across Azure regions and your Azure Local locations. Fundamental compute, storage, networking, Kubernetes, all those services you could have them running locally on your Azure Local infrastructure, enabling VMs, enabling containers. You could even enable PaaS services like databases, like AI services, and operate them under that Azure control plane, right? Another key feature is whenever you do want to start diving into that Azure Local component, you can actually bring in your Azure engineers because the single pane of glass that you're going to manage most of this is going to be the Azure portal, right? You're going to use the Azure tools. You're going to use Azure ACI. So you can, double dip. You can use those Azure engineers and those Azure architects whenever you're diving into back into the hardware component. Another key component that I think has actually just been popping up here recently is Microsoft 365 Local, right? Specifically in Europe, you'll see a little bit more of this, but Microsoft is trying to create that sovereign cloud initiative by providing Microsoft 365 local services and using the Azure Local as a key component for that hardware component, right? So it's an actual sovereign private cloud. With this setup, it allows critical cloud services to run in country or on premise under the cloud, the Azure local control, right? So the customer is going to have full control of their hardware while it's still integrating into Azure's global management and security. It's been in the news a lot because, there's still questions on, is that still a sovereign cloud, right? Some of the bits and components are still managed by Microsoft. But as, we started this conversation, the whole component of this was for Azure to be able to extend and actually start saying, okay, you want to have more control of this and not just let me control that whole responsibility model of PaaS, SaaS, and IaaS. Okay, let me start shifting a lot of that towards the customer for responsibility. Microsoft's also starting to build off of their Azure Local, their Kubernetes-based infrastructure for local AI modeling, which edge data to satisfy low latency and regulatory requirements. Customers will now be able to implement this Kubernetes cluster extension, and I showed it to you earlier when we were running through the Windows Admin Center, the Kubernetes component. Well, you'll actually start being able to use that extension to run an AKS-enabled Azure Arc part of your cluster, and you'll be able to do seamless enablement to get either an LLM deployment where you can store different containers. You'll be able to start pulling all these AI models closer to the home, right? Which is actually one of the key components that Microsoft has feared about Copilot, where there's a lot of customers that are still thinking, well, that Copilot and that AI infrastructure is still too far from my grasp. It's still too far from my regulatory requirements or my regulatory boundaries. Well, with Kata now, you'll be able to actually leverage Kubernetes based off of Azure Local and running it, pretty much in your data centers or in your sovereign cloud. And then Ops as a Service. I think Azure Arc will still be that bridge, and like I said before, it's going to be that main component that Microsoft is going to leverage in their adaptive cloud strategy. I think they're going to still keep on using it to deliver IT operations through cloud-based services and automation, but right now it's a little bit more manual. But you're going to start seeing it as an actual Ops as a Service. Just from the screenshots that I showed you earlier from the Windows Admin Center, you could already see all the components that you can actually dive into. But as we see more features start popping in there, you're going to be able to do a single pane of glass and have Ops as a Service being provided by Microsoft's Adaptive Cloud. If any of these components are going to be, I think, the driving force of how big the Adaptive Cloud can grow, it's going to be that last feature. And I think Microsoft is going to heavily invest in it because at the end of the day, I know AI is what everyone is listening to, but we also have to understand that AI and all those components, at the end of the day, they run on something, right? They have to run on hardware. They have to run their services in a type of environment that can provide resources for it. Well, the infrastructure has to have some kind of management to it. And if we can have all these different infrastructures and all these different type of cloud environments that best benefits the customer, but still have that single pane of glass for IT operations, then I think that's a win-win situation for Microsoft, and obviously that's a win-win for the customer. So I think Ops as a Service is probably going to be the best features that Microsoft is going to try to focus on. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what Adaptive Cloud is. I want to open it up for questions, obviously, through chat. I want to thank, again, the sponsors. I want to thank you. I think at the end of the day, it's very important to understand that Adaptive Cloud is a strategy. Adaptive Cloud is going to allow the customer to have control, own more of that responsibility model, but also give you that management interface that you will need to leverage to be able to feel comfortable with implementing public cloud and local cloud into your environment. So I'm open up for questions. Okay, well, I'll stay on very much. I do want to thank you. I hope you found this information encouraging to be able to expand your cloud environments, and know that Microsoft will always have a tool for you to be able to leverage Azure in your local environments. Thank you.